welcome everyone to this event on interspecies care. My name is Jack Thacker. I'm a poet and researcher based at Nottingham Trent University, where I help to coordinate the Critical Poetics Research Group. This year, we've partnered up with 3 thriving and vital Nottingham institutions: Nottingham Contemporary, Curated and Created at Nottingham Trent University, and Metronome, to bring you this series of public events exploring care in all its contexts. We've already heard from the incredible Michael Rosen, Estrida Nameless, and Marion Coots so far this week. If you missed them, recordings of their events are now available via Nottingham Contemporaries and Nottingham Trent University's YouTube channels. And we're in the process of adding professional captions to those recordings, so look out for those. Tonight, we're delighted to host Mama D Ujuaje, Maya Chowdhry, and Eva Giraud for a performance and discussion on interspecies care. But before I introduce tonight's speakers, I'd just like to say a few words about the Critical Poetics Summer School, of which these events are a part. In this, its inaugural year, our International Summer School investigates care, and in particular how, especially in these challenging times for the cared for and the caring, critical and creative thinking and practice might help us to attend to manifold and interconnected issues of care. Every day this week, our amazing summer school participants have been discussing and interrogating these issues, and we're delighted to invite you to join the conversation this evening for this special event. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our guests. Maya Chowdhry is a writer and multidisciplinary artist. Her work explores issues such as seed sovereignty and climate justice, and her poetry collections are first The Seamstress and the Global Garment, and more recently, Fossil. Her work utilizes online platforms for transmedia storytelling and augmented reality artworks. And her award-winning writing includes Butterfly Orchid, which was highly commended for the Forward Poetry Prize, and Tales from the Towpath, an immersive story for Manchester Literature Festival, which was shortlisted for the International New Media Writing Prize. She is our writer in residence for the Critical Poetics Summer School in 2021. Mama D Ujuaje is a community researcher and facilitator whose background is in food, nourishment practice, and artistic advocacy around food justice. Her primary interests are in how humans navigate justice issues over time and space, and manage personal and social trauma in embodied ways across the territories of the Anthropocene. Focusing on both the physiology and the psychology of nourishment, Mama D encourages the expression of withheld stories from a wide range of bodies, getting beneath the skin of the everyday. Eva Giraud is a senior lecturer in media at Keele University. Her work focuses on environmental, animal, and food activism, with more recent research addressing anti-racist politics. She also has a broad conceptual interest in non-anthropocentric theoretical work, which explores ways of thinking and acting in the world that move beyond the treatment of some humans as exceptional. Her publications include What Comes After Entanglement, Activism, Anthropocentrism, and an Ethics of Exclusion, and Veganism, Politics, Practice, and Theory. Eva will be joining Maya and Mama D for a discussion shortly. First, I'm delighted to present to you the following multimedia performance from Maya and Mama D, which addresses interspecies care.
We acknowledge our elders, our mothers, fathers, grandmothers, who have roots in the soil and directly process the sun. We also acknowledge our inner biota, who maintain our connections. Even when we forget, they let us know. They remind us who we really be.
I acknowledge I am an artist living in the global north, and through this, I have the privilege of spending time deeply with life, observing its many beings, away from the lenses of production and consumption.
Giving ourselves names is a convention that doesn't always allow us to know each other better. So how do you want to know me? Will you rely on your eyes, or will you go a little deeper?
I'm personally fascinated by the depth of humans' relationships to seeds and plants, and which one humans have cultivated for food, medicine, ritual, shelter, fuel, clothes, and more.
I'm interested in exploring beingness and becoming outside of the gaze of the human who makes me less than human, the colonial, the one who seeks dominion. I prefer to ally myself with what gives us nourishment.
These relationships have always been coloured by access to knowledge about these plant species, and also our human viewpoint on their origin, cultivation, and consumption.
This getting to know our kinfolk who are green and brown, red and yellow, purple and blue, has been made all the more possible because of the colour of our knowledge and our refusals. Refusal to specify and give names, to recognise that time is measured differently by beings who have been around multiples of my and other human lifetimes. I like the idea of cultivation, and it is familyhood that I seek to cultivate with these beings who have refined the art of resistance. I eschew consumption with its overtones of the capitalization of life. Though it is the current narrative, it can be where it is, and I can search for and find other relatedness.
My own empirical knowledge of plant species was gained by planting my first seeds, lupins, at age 6. Killing some baby carrot seedlings because I was told they were weeds, and being fed by my granddad's garden winter, summer, spring, and autumn.
The way of a child. My own misdeeds were in disrespecting snails, and I still find myself in a tangle of hierarchy and meaning over how to relate to them and their kin. It is my grandmother who taught me that cultivation meant using what you have, so many things became seed, and soil had a smell to it that to this day reminds me of my early years making mud cakes. It was my dad who taught me that there is not a thing called a weed. And my mum, she showed me that everything flowers.
This performance documents our own interrelationships with how these species are woven into the fabric of our lives. Mama D and I particularly chose these beings, as through them they illuminate entanglements.
Indeed, everything relates. And if we are quiet and listen, observe with more than our eyes, and notice our own stems, roots, and branches, we stand a chance of gaining the respect of this elder life and its generosity towards us, despite our hopeless greed and ineptness.
Growing up, bananas were always on top of the fruit bowl, destined to be mashed with chocolate ice cream, went soggy in fruit salad. I never liked overripe bananas, preferring the slightly starchy, tart flesh. I learnt of the scarcity of bananas in Britain from my mum, who had never seen nor eaten one until age 14 after the war. I never knew there were any other type of bananas until I went to India as a child and saw bicycles riding by piled high with bunches of different coloured bananas on stalks, red and yellow and purple, tiny little bananas you could eat in a couple of mouthfuls. I greet the whole banana plant when I first encounter it as a child. Then later, fresh banana leaves become my plate, and my fingers utensils to feed myself. I never knew bananas did not grow on trees. Were not one but many plants, named false by humans because they didn't bend to their will, produce food for them. I hardly eat bananas these days. I don't really know why. Something to do with radiation and potassium, but I can't remember where I read it. When I do, I buy the organic fair trade ones from my local whole food shop when they have them to sell. I discover a banana plant in Hume Community Garden Centre, and on summer afternoons sit in the polytunnel under its broad leaves, dreaming that I am in Kerala, watching a banana heart flower pink, with hands of fruit, a stem of fingers, its lime green leaves waft in the breeze, like a lapwing taking flight. Rice and I were acquainted when we kids got to eat dinner with our hands. A banned process otherwise, so no eating your mashed potato that way. Another day I was confused, eating tinned ambrosia creamed rice, when my mum rapped my knuckles with a spoon for using my fingers to slurp it up. It was a revelation to be able to play with your food, caress it with your fingers, feel its textures, its warmth, and then squidge it together, ready to travel from plate to mouth. The first time I travelled alone in India as an adult, I really understood something about not only the etiquette of eating with your right hand, how you handled the food delicately, carefully placing it in your mouth without dropping any rice on your clothes, but also the necessity of knowing where your hand had been, as opposed to the cutlery that was presented to you. The first time I cooked rice in India, I was shocked at how many stones we had to pick out of it, and how small and split the grains were. Eventually, I abandoned my eating of white basmati rice in favour of brown basmati rice, keeping the husks for protein, enjoying the flavour and the chewiness. The first time I saw rice grass growing was when I visited some projects in rural Tamil Nadu. It put into perspective my rice eating, seeing that back-breaking work, human hands dipping in and out of the paddy, transplanting the seedlings. I remember looking out at the fields stretching into the distance and wondering how humans and plants could really live in harmony. But then seeing the rice plant at home in its environment, its long flattened leaves, the hollow stalks submerged in water, helped me to connect with rice as its own entity, living in its own world, as opposed to seeing it as fuel for my human body. I met coffee in the teenage place. I wanted to stay up all night with my friends, debating veganism, fair trade, and the politics of food. It was the 1970s, and coffee was Nescafe, instant freeze-dried, found in a jar with a brown label for 25.5 pence. Meanwhile, coffee had her roots in the understory of an Afro-montane rainforest, her root nodules feeding on Ethiopian soil. I had no idea of her human names, of Jasminium arabecum or Coffea arabica, or that her broad, glossy dark green leaves and purply red cherries were percolating my perception. Coffee and me grew apart. I rarely drank the black nectar of her roasted seeds, for fear of the place I went with her intoxication, hypervigilant and awake, unable to untangle my thoughts and dream myself to sleep. When I found out the violent colonial history of coffee, how it was stolen from its lands, along with African slaves, in the blood-drenched triangular trade, I stopped drinking coffee. I was a young adult, avoiding the purchase and consumption of cash crops with the violent past with humans, the green-washed present in the fair trade and relationship coffee that kept humans happy, and coffee plants' adaptation stifled out of existence. We never crossed paths after that. Coffee's bitter black made my tongue sour and my throat dry. Coffee tells me you want it to be happy, have everything it needs to produce the highest quality and abundant seeds. Happiness is human, it says. It just wants to be alive and fertile, it says. The way humans treat it, it can barely survive. I grew up with the idea of ready-made and was always puzzled when my friends at school just talked about clothes. At home we made the distinction between going to a tailor to get your clothes made and the clothes you bought in the shop. It was the 70s in Scotland and there was hardly a scrap of cotton in sight, except tie-dye cheesecloth. As a young adult in 1986, I would only buy organic cotton clothes from the Bristol Bishopston Trading Company, where they directly sourced them from the village of KV Kupam in South India. But let's rewind through my family relationships, my growing up in Scotland, my relationships to other so-called non-human beings, to my why. It is 1976, and I am reading the spring edition of the vegan magazine, and I've just found out that cottonseed is used to make margarine. There's nowhere to Google, but I stare at a black and white drawing of a cotton plant, admire its fluffy bolls, marvel at the downy white fibre cocooning its capsules, wonder at the breeze that disperses its seeds. It is in this magazine, and beyond the sanitised history taught in school, I discover the web of lies spun to hide Britain's sordid past, and vow to step away from the exploitation. And then fast forward 35 years to me living in Manchester, the place that was named Cottonopolis. Glazed shipping holes, blink reflections, glimpsing the undertow, casting an Indian woman in a floral cotton skirt. The warehouse of the Western world tramples meadows, as a rural backwater is straddled by the merchant's bridge and 40 shilling a tonne of cotton becomes 6. Canal arms grab barges, steer pilfered cotton from Spanish West India traders into the Royal Exchange. Standing on the canal side, her face ripples sunlight, becomes threads of guinea cloth unravelling the binary of who she's become. Sugar and me met in the Turkish delights my sister and I made as kids. Icing sugar was white as snow, shiny, silky, dissolved your tongue into smiles. We marvelled and delighted at how brown sugar liquefied from its crystals into sweet syrup, how it disappeared into butter-making creamy fudge. Sugar was transformation. Meanwhile, sugar's tall, cane-like greenish violet grasses sway in the warm, wet breeze of a plantation in Gujarat. The rough, rasping, saw-toothed edges of its leaves greet the air in symbiotic breath. Sugar was what we had for lunch, spending our dinner money on Snickers and bubble gum. Sugar accompanied our homework, sprinkled on buttery toasted sugar sandwiches. Sugar and I were formally introduced in history and biology, condensed versions of the violence of British colonialism, and how sugar could give energy to my cells, dopamine to my brain. I loved sugar for its sweet memories of fairy cakes with butterfly wings, treacle sponge puddings and ice cream sundaes. All would be bereft without sugar. But I didn't love the granulated history of Tate and Lyle, its white crystal stained red with the blood of enslaved humans on Caribbean plantations. So white sugar and me went our separate ways, and I baked with molasses, caring for my body, whilst trying to eat in a fairer way for all. But sugar made me crash and burn, and that's when I discovered sugar was not for me.
The only thing for me is me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning. Some people like the chocolate, some people like the tea. Some drink sugar and water, and some the lemonade. But I cares for none of these. The only thing for me is me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning. Me coffee, me coffee, me coffee, me coffee, me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning. I cares for none of these. The only thing for me is me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning. At the sunrise I gets up every morning, dry or wet, so as never to be elated for the work I has to do. I generally says me prayers, but sometimes I forget. But me always drink me coffee in the morning. Me coffee, me coffee, me coffee, me coffee, me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning. I cares for none of these. The only thing for me is me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning. Sometimes I has it run with me ackee and saltfish, and me yellow heart breadfruit, ripe pear and coconut oil. But what me mind does give me for more better than the rest is coffee with a gill bread in the morning. Me coffee, me coffee, me coffee, me coffee, me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning. can still hold together and still praise the Lord. If I only gets me coffee in the morning. Me coffee, me coffee, me coffee, me coffee, me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning. I cares for none of these. The only thing for me is me bowl of boiling coffee in the morning.
Hi, we're moving on now to the discussion section with Maya and Mama D. And I just wanted to say, like, well, it's not really my place to say thank you, but how much I enjoyed watching those particularly layered together like that. It was just really inspiring and moving. And yeah, I've got loads of thoughts, but again, I don't think it's my place to kind of kick off with loads of thoughts. So I just wondered, are there anything that you'd both like to start the conversation with?
Well, perhaps I can begin by saying I too have had that experience watching it all together like this. And what it reminds me of is the extent to which all our lives here on earth are woven together. Woven's a nice soft word, isn't it? You think of cotton, cloth, or silk, or any of these fabrics that have been extracted from the so-called global south. And it makes one feel good. But in actual fact, they were more like a violent ripping and placing on top of each other in uncomfortable layers that we have until today. And I'm interested in our encounter here today to talk about the continuing consumption, extraction, exploitation, and lack of care in all our relations.
Yeah, just responding to that. So I very much made my performance really about my own journey, because I felt like that's where I wanted to start, and that's where, if I start in that way and think about my own relationship to these species, I can have a grasp on what I think and what my relationship has been over the years and what my relationship has been now. So I like the contrast, Mama D, of your and mine material and the different places and how it went. And we asked Metronome to put them in a random order because of just what has happened to those species. It's not necessarily been random, but there is like a random association of bringing things together.
Yeah, because when I was I felt like the randomness for me helped trace out lots of unexpected connections and questions, and kind of kept things open, I suppose, in terms of thinking about what those connections might be. And one of the things I wanted to really ask both of you is, what do you think the kind of challenges are of trying to open up space, of telling these really situated stories and evoking, I think Mama D, you sort of mentioned earlier that kind of question of whether it's possible to speak for plants or advocate for plants or find ways of what are the challenges of, I suppose, representation and telling those stories?
Perhaps, I mean, there are definitely challenges, but there are also opportunities in telling new stories, or stories that don't necessarily find their way to the surface. I mean, we can't speak for plants, But then again, there is that expression, we are what we eat. So are we in a kind of continuity with all other life in any case? And it's a false proposition to think about speaking on behalf, because actually we are part of any other species that we consume in any way at all, whether it's through our mouths or through being able to gaze upon it, wear it on our skins, apply it on our skins. So all of these things open for us opportunities for shared responsibility for the continuation of life on Earth. I think that's how I would like to look at it.
And I think for me, the challenge is then, in order to like express those stories, I had to, you know, think very personally and deeply. And then we're sharing this publicly. So, you know, there's that awkwardness when you feel like you make yourself vulnerable by telling your own personal story. And so I think that's a challenge for me, and maybe that's a challenge for other people. So the sugar video is the most sugar I've eaten for a very long time, and I really enjoyed it. It did make me like I had a bit of a sugar high afterwards. I didn't drink the coffee because that really would have sent me spiraling into like a kind of a stimulated place, but that's interesting in itself. So then I think this an opportunity for shared responsibility, so taking responsibility for your own story, and then how once you can inhabit that place and take responsibility for your own story, then how do we use that opportunity to take some, you know, shared responsibility.
That's one of the things that, because I think that all of the videos ask questions of for me, they ask questions of those who watch them as well. Like, you know, I suppose it's really, and it sounds like a really glib thing to say, but it is really easy to sort of buy something off the shelf and not think of both the journey in a kind of physical sense, but the legacy of that product and what's been kind of shut down in the process of it getting to you in the form that it does. But also I think for me it started to ask some really difficult questions about the kind of everyday ethical practices that I engage with, and the types of, you know, I suppose I kind of think about you know, whether something's vegan or not, or whether something, you know, on a kind of basic level. But there are so many more kind of complicated questions that I think the videos kind of throw up about production, consumption, history, and kind of pluralism. For me, it's, you know, I feel like my world's quite kind of narrowed in types of the range of products I buy, and looking at that, you know, the stories about bananas in particular, and the kind of, I suppose, the heterogeneity and the diversity that's kind of been lost there. Yeah, for me, it was raising all these really complicated questions about that relationship between the individual and the personal, and the, you know, and ethics on that level, and these kind of really complicated sort of supply chains and processes that you know, that are entangled with those objects, and it's a real kind of struggle, I think, to work out how to sort of navigate those issues. And the point you made there about how that goes into something collective, I think, is such a difficult one, but such a key one.
Yeah, indeed. It makes me think, whenever I'm in the situation to be part of a discussion about ethical consumption or ethical production, if there is such a thing, given the nature of the so-called food system, the objectification of everything, including some bodies. So there is an entanglement I'm experiencing every day. My story is also the world story. How do I tell the world story without inevitably implicating my daily life. My daily life is that one of exoticism, of being objectified as other, just as the sugarcane is. Yeah? My association with sugarcane and its various purported origins, yeah, and all of the other exotic, hard to reach foods inhabiting a hard to reach body in the here and now. So it automatically generates a kind of empathy for the narratives of these the great variety of foods, many of which originate from the global south, as indeed does my lineage. Yeah. So there is no separation ever. Yeah. And even the humble potato bears that narrative, and it bears that narrative importantly through so many of the world's lives. So it's not just Peru. Yeah, it's Ireland, it's the United States of America. It's also the Italians who, when they first encountered it, thought there's no way we're eating that and threw it overboard. So we're all entangled in some way or the other. It's just that some bodies are able to be objectively spoken about in this kind of, well, over there kind of way.
Can I ask something else about the kind of how the films were working to, I suppose, open up a kind of, for me, I kept thinking about the kind of plurality that was being expressed. So I think beforehand, Mama D, you mentioned that kind of the idea of the pluriverse and what's shut down when not thinking about things in a pluralistic sense. And I was kind of wondering to what extent that was something really important that you were both trying to kind of convey in the films.
I mean, I loved Maya's presentation of all of the otherwise exotic, but in the everyday, situated in her life growing up, the narrative she's speaking about of growing up here in England, not far away, even though she did visit, various places. She's here. She's definitely situated here. So we have to recognize, we're forced to recognize that current entanglement, it cannot be kind of shunted off into, past places or distant places. So the fact of how coffee is held in the world today, and it's kind of I don't know, it has this dark side that is not spoken of in our earlier workshop today. So many people who were avid drinkers of coffee were yet unaware of how the plant grew, or the circumstances of its processing. Yeah. So, I mean, each and everything that we interact with has this longer, wider, broader, deeper history. But Maya, I don't know if you want to.
Well, I mean, I certainly missed things out. I mean, I might have slightly romanticized some things about growing up in Scotland, because the other side of all the eating with your hands and enjoying touching the rice and, was being called curry face at school. And, but, I omitted that because I was enjoying going on like my own journey. And like I said in the video, it wasn't until I met a banana plant in India that I connected in a different way to eating bananas. And I think maybe that's one thing, so all the things that are imported here from other places around the world, you know, and like Mama D said today, people not knowing that about coffee cherries being red, so drinking the coffee and then having no connection with the plant at all. And the same thing with like meeting a rice plant in Tamil Nadu in India really changed. The next time I tasted rice, also in that village, after having seen it grown and seeing the workers working in the flooded fields, really changed how I felt about. I really thought that about the rice being the seeds of that plant, as opposed to a foodstuff for a human. So yeah, so there are, you know, all these multiple layers of the stories as well. And then we've used like different visuals, and then there's the story that you tell with the visuals, and then there's the story you tell with your voice, and that kind of layering, just trying to go to different kind of ways of thinking and connecting, and allowing space as well, with like using the music as well, which you used a lot, Mama D, to allow a space of what does that trigger in people's minds and memories, and then where does it take you, because it takes you like somewhere emotionally in a way that the images in the videos can do as well. And also that thing when you like, apparently you don't, after you know the taste of something, you don't, when you eat it, you don't actually need to taste it, because your brain, or however it works, remembers that taste. And then, yeah, like when you smell and look at a banana, you can remember the taste. So there's all these sensory layers as well.
It is true, within our bodies, and that's in our individual bodies, there's this sensory pluralism where our eyes are connected in so many ways to our olfactory senses and our sense of touch. Never mind the bodies which we make up of as community, or the larger bodies, kin going back, nations, different kinds of, I want to say, human and non-human ecologies. Myself here at this desk is surrounded by a number of exotic plants, having a communication in an environment in which, well, it's supposed to be unfamiliar, but pineapple that's growing on my desk here, when did it come here? It's been around in England. It even forms a decoration for many fences, doesn't it? Railings. You see pineapple plants in central London, and bananas, as banana plant and various citrus, and they've been here for centuries. Although new, they're all small plants, and the narratives of their lives and my lives are already really, really entangled. And the politics of the pineapple, the politics of banana growing and fifes and United Fruit Company, now Chiquita, and that story in itself being a story of wanting to maintain economic domination. Yeah. So and then all the hinterland to that, in terms of ensuring that production can take place to enable that economic domination, which means large numbers are consuming it instead of just a community that knows its particular banana and its lineage.
When I was looking, got a kind of sneak preview, obviously, of the work. And when I was looking at both banana videos in particular, it made me want to kind of do a bit of reading about, how one type of banana had become so standardized, was certainly standardized from a perspective of, I don't know, going into Asda or something, there's a kind of dominant, I suppose, banana that I'd certainly access in the UK. And one of the things that I think really shocked me and made me feel really naive was the amount of kind of work that goes into making and sustaining a particular type of banana as being dominant, as being the one that's sold, as being the one that's kind of mass grown, mass distributed. And it kind of, one of the things that really kind of struck me about it was the reliance on certain kind of chemicals in order to preserve this particular type of banana from pests, or so-called pests, and how harmful that was from the people that farmed it, and potentially to people that ate it. And I think, Maya, you kind of hinted a bit about some of the politics of bananas in your video. But when I was reading about it, something in particular kind of leapt out was that this, because there's such a reliance on the industry now of a particular kind of standard type of banana, which has only become standard really because it's easy to transport, and it's the one that's most easy to transport kind of large distances. It's now put the entire kind of large scale industry under threat, because apparently it's kind of vulnerable to a particular type of fungus that banana, it affects that banana in particular, and it doesn't have any defenses against. And I was kind of reading some of the things about it, and or about these types of problems, and I just wanted to read a quote from Julie Guthman's Wilted, which isn't about bananas, it's about strawberries, that I think kind of speaks to this idea of problems being created by sort of large scale agriculture and standardization processes that have kind of techno-fixed solutions that end up kind of undoing the whole industry. So with strawberries, for instance, strawberry farming is entirely reliant on fumigation, certainly in California. And as Guthman says, the solution of fumigation, of spraying chemicals over the strawberries to kill pests, was once lauded for its efficacy and the dramatic changes it brought to the rest of the production system. But now fumigation has become the problem. Fumigation's a source of iatrogenic harm, referring to the problem of a cure causing illness. And it's just this idea that all of the kind of tools that are being used in agriculture or large scale agriculture to kill pests, to kind of standardize crops, are now almost kind of leading to huge problems when pests become resistant, when there are issues with particular breeds that are now the standard breed to use. And it just seems that so many kind of tensions and are sort of created by, you know, the techno fixes that are designed to standardize and produce crops on such a kind of large scale.
Isn't it unfortunate, though, that when we continue that particular narrative of industrial agriculture, basically, that we end up blaming consumers, so-called. We say they should have better habits, they should eat more organically, you know, they shouldn't waste what is produced, as if they were somehow party to the design of the industrial production and the lineage of that industrial production. So we do need to turn the gaze again back to the whole architecture of food produced en masse to feed, as we feed animals, right? Or we feed the poor who are next up from animals, right? Although, yes, we're animals, we know that, but we know the pejorativeness of that term when applied to humans or those who are considered, you know, not completely human, and, you know, all of the politics around that. But we do need to turn the gaze and wonder, what is it that we have to eat so continuously, yeah, to stem what? Is there some kind of hunger that is not being named, perhaps? Maybe it's an emotional hunger. Maybe it's like people who comfort eat, you know, comfort eating. Is it comfort eating en masse? Because if we keep on eating in this extractive and exploitative way, we don't have to really think about, you know, the rest of the harm that our lives are causing. And that's all of us everywhere, because that system now has replicated itself globally. Yeah, so we're now all dependent on it. How do we extract ourselves from those kinds of toxic entanglements? Yeah, when they're implicated in our very sense of the way we can articulate well-being, right? So this sometimes there are these discussions about, I think I need to eat yam because it's, you know, my cultural food, or, you know, there's a whole narrative to yam. But I am also aware that the manner in which it reaches the market here performs a violence to people, various people en route. Yeah, it isn't ethical, but in another sense, it's the food that offers me a necessary emotional, cultural, social link, both to the places that I hail from, but also within communities laterally here. Yeah. And in fact, those who sell and who distribute the yam are not necessarily the same people who are consuming it. Yeah, because again, there's been this on a different scale of industrial process. So I think there are lots of different different scaled narratives that are entangled, and we tend to look at some and not at others. How can we open up these to a gaze that's pro-healing, perhaps?
Maya, a lot of your pieces were about, as you said, that kind of personal navigation of that journey of kind of reaching ethical decision, or reaching decisions that seem sort of responsive in some ways to that complexity. And I think what I found really, really helpful about them was it sort of tying together those two, the level of the kind of the bodily and the kind of pleasure associated with memories attached to foods, but also how that's kind of cut across by these really complicated ethical decisions about what to consume, where to consume it from. And yeah, I keep coming back to this question of the kind of collective responses, because I think, as you said, Mama D, it's really tricky to kind of, the discourse does keep coming back to consumers, doesn't it? Or what can kind of we do as consumers? How can we consume differently? And I think I kind of am quite a defender of I feel like sometimes consumer action can get, or consumer is probably the wrong word, sometimes personal action can be treated really dismissively. So our personal kind of ethical navigations, you kind of hear quite a lot that, oh, individual lifestyle change doesn't do anything, it doesn't mean anything, etc. And I'm really kind of feel uncomfortable with that sort of dismissal of individual ethical action, and I feel sometimes there's too much dismissiveness, but at the same time as kind of thinking there's real value in it, that kind of idea of collective and structural change, and holding certain institutions accountable for their, you know, devastating practices when they're using certain chemicals, when they're engaging in certain labor practices, when they're clearing land to make way for, you know, soy plantations, you know, all of these questions I think are quite difficult to hold together.
Yeah, and I think that I think it was actually easier when I was younger, because it was much, well, certainly in Scotland, it was much harder to say, get something like an aubergine, which might have given me like a nourishment in a curry in one way, but they weren't here. Now they are here, and so I think it is much more complex, and we know more. And then I'm older, and I think a bit like you, Mama D, thinking about well, you know, I want to, for a certain amount of my food, eat locally and sustainably and ethically, and it's a much more complex web.
and it probably always was, but like my thinking and where I am with it is different. So for example, when I was making the video, I thought I better Google the Bishopston Trading Company and see if I can find a photo, and it's closed down now after about 35 years or something like that, because like the world has changed, and people are buying differently now. And it didn't really say that in the article, but you know, you can buy like we've got the web now, so you can buy like organic fair trade cotton on the web. So like it, but then what was unique about that project was it was just directly working with that village. And so that seemed like a kind of how to align your ethics with the rest of your life, and actually how to align my ethics seemed much simpler. But then of course, if things have changed around vegan eating, it is much more difficult. Some things help you to align your ethical practices. So like you can buy quinoa that's grown in Sussex now, which you never used to be able to. And you can buy lentils. They've been trying to grow lentils as well. So it's like layers of different webs. But it is like, I think how I see it is about being a citizen rather than a consumer. So a citizen in terms of your thoughts around your relationship with different species. And I think that if you're a citizen and you go to the shop as a citizen, or you go to your garden centre as a citizen, I think you're like awakened to these thought processes, and then it's joining that up. So I was in the vegan society for a while, except they kept all falling out with each other at the meetings, and I definitely wanted to be part of a community, and then I was part of different communities and food growing communities. And so I think definitely being part of communities and like working things out together as well.
That's so true. Sorry, but you're going to say something?
No, I was just going to say I found that so helpful. Just in my own head, I was like, yeah, of course. I was struggling to articulate the word that wasn't consumer, but that kind of idea of that difference between citizen and consumer, I just think such a helpful way of thinking. But sorry, Mama D.
No, not at all. I mean, citizen is certainly one word, but it still feels like to me, are we then not talking about people who are not documented because of the politics of space and geographies and power and all of this? So how can we recognize that we can't, I don't know, it's like single factor align with anything. So there's the food and the nourishment that goes into our mouths, but there's so much, we live our lives in much more complicated ways than just eating through our mouths. We have fuels to keep ourselves warm, we wear clothes, we anoint our bodies, we wear perfumes and shoes, and drink water. And all of these things interface with a much wider hinterland than maybe we can deploy a certain amount of responsibility around the things that goes in our that do enter our mouths. And were we to there is a politics around the idea of localism, yeah, because our bodies haven't been assembled with that localism in mind. There are long historic processes. So sometimes to try to make sense of things, we do have to look at time as well as space. So what does it mean to take those things into our computations of what it means to live ethically? Do we do that enough, or are we perhaps because of how much we navigate our lives through the lens of the visual, we only think spatially, or we think mostly spatially, and we don't think temporally as much, and the consequences of long histories of violence, effectively, which have left all of us so traumatized. Even when we're making decisions, they're very partial. Yeah, they overlook lots of important factors about how we are nourished or how we become malnourished. Malnourishment is not restricted to, you know, the typical image of a starving child in a remote place, but right here we're malnourished in terms of our relations with others and with other beings, and all beings, all different forms of life, because how do we express gratitude? Yeah, how do we understand really what is poverty, when we only tend to look at, I don't know, income as an index of poverty, but there are all these other kinds of impoverishment that we live with daily. And so it seems to me that these entanglements are spoken about in various different ways by the work that we've assembled here. But we need to pay attention to all of the different interwoven factors if we're to try to come to a place where we can move towards healing more comfortably. We can hear the narratives of other beings, and I think this is where the interbeing, the care of the more than human comes to the fore, because to understand the whole lineage of pineapple gives it a different perspective than just simply allocating it to one of those things that's imported from a place far away. It's like really understanding the lives, the human lives that are entangled in the fact that the pineapple is here and is sold in supermarkets and market stalls. We have to think about transact so many different interfaces with that which is not us, that which is not named as human, and to start to navigate and negotiate around what really is the human and what really is the nourishment of the human. Yeah, in all the ways. One cannot be nourished if one is not also responsible for nourishing all of the rest of the earth. Yeah, and what's our role here where we sit in all of those other transactions? And can we carve out a small area? You know, can we stop plastic pollution just around the British Isles and then say, yes, our work is done, and sit comfortably as if the whole sea and air and everything, you know, isn't constantly in motion and interfacing with us? So I would that we find the tools to be able to examine the entanglement in which we find ourselves. Yeah, not to look for things that are overly simple, simplistic, but to go to where it's slightly complicated. But we are complicated beings. I'm sure that we have complex tools, not so complicated, but complex. We are, as ourselves, a complex being. So I'm sure we can evolve, co-evolve, co-create complex tools to understand our entanglements.
I've got a couple of questions actually that people have asked from YouTube. So the first one is it goes back to the filmmaking practice, and I think again about complexity potentially and anthropocentrism. So how do you both feel about anthropocentrism in writing and film? Is it something we should embrace, or is it something we should resist? Anthropomorphism, not anthropocentrism, sorry. How do you feel about anthropomorphism, which is obviously a different question? Is it a device we should embrace or resist? Do either of you have any thoughts?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
So I think both. Like, I just follow on from what Mama D said about complexity, is that I don't think there is necessarily one answer, because I think it depends what it is you're doing. So I think when there's like a certain documentary speaking in a particular way on the behalf, or instead of speaking on the behalf but trying to say that that is the voice of that plant or something, if it's unhelpful to this understanding, then maybe it doesn't work. But I think there are times, I mean, I'm a poet, and I think there are times where depending on what it is you want to say, it might be the most, I mean, you talked about tools, Mama D, but it might be the most appropriate tool at that moment for what it is you're trying to say, and in which case, yeah, I would embrace it. I don't know what you think, Mama D.
I think if we were kind, we wouldn't seek to judge in the way we do the motives of how things are deployed to attain a healing effect. It's different when somebody is seeking power and power over and this kind of thing, or seeking some kind of dominance or authority. But I think if it helps in explaining something to a child for now, then, you know, by all means, one can embrace it in a limited way. But then I have to ask the question, what really is anthropocentrism? Because are there beings on the planet who are considered anthropos as opposed to humanitas, yeah, and are studied by anthropologists as opposed to sociologists, yeah? And so the idea, the root idea of anthropocentrism, what is the history? I want to know, really, what is the history of that? Is it because we can we have this distance between how we understand ourselves all as as animals, yeah, but scientists in the course of scientific racism have created a hierarchy in which some humans are more anthropos than they are humanitas, and so you know, it's complicated to even just answer that question because it has history. And this is what I was saying about temporality, looking at long histories and not only the kind of, you know, how we objectify the spaces around us in the present.
Yeah, I've been writing a piece where I've been trying to just, I suppose it's like a long review essay of books I found really helpful over the past year. And what's really interesting is that there are some texts that are really trying to extend and deepen critiques of anthropocentrism by saying we need to move away from seeing kind of humans as central and think about how to foster care, you know, for other beings. And then on the other hand, there are texts saying, well, we need to, yes, but we also need to maybe rethink our use of terms like anthropocentrism. And I think you mentioned it sort of before the talk, actually, like Jackson's Becoming Human really kind of says, is that a helpful term for understanding what's going on? Or is it a kind of term that flattens out and treats humans as a kind of homogenous entity that ignores racialized processes of becoming human? And I think these two things going on, I'd hope that they'll come into more dialogue. But it is a time, I think, for fields that have sought to sort of think about ethics kind of beyond the human, to kind of come into much more dialogue with really questioning some of the sort of, I think, fundamental terms that are commonly used to make sense of those relationships, like anthropocentrism. Yeah, and I think moving forward, that's something that theoretically is going to have to be central, really, to what theorists and they're trying to work through.
I do agree. Can I just add there that that dialogue perhaps needs to be between the Swami and the shaman as well as the the European theorists. Yeah, if we don't have that kind of dialogue, whatever we arrive at will still only be partial.
Yeah. No. And sorry, I've got another couple of questions as well. So there's a specific one saying, in Women in the Edge of Time, coffee is only drunk on special occasions. Do you both think that a way to decolonize relationships with food is to return to the ceremonial? Is it possible to sort of rethink foods in that way? You know, could we do this in the everyday, kind of use ideas of the ceremonial to sort of shift relationships with food?
Well, I used to always bless my food before I ate it, and it's been particularly bad this year. I think it's too much sitting at home in front of the computer, and then we would go to like work with this theatre company, and we would always say some kind of blessing before we ate of the beings. So yeah, every day in terms of like blessing and connecting with everything, not like Mama D said, not just the food, but like thinking about what you're wearing and where it's come from and where you are in the world and how you relate to everybody. And so I think, yeah, blessings and more kindness, really. I don't know if that, I mean, I don't really know like that what the history is with that, with those kind of ceremonies, because was it about something being scarce and, you know, like the sort of stimulating effect of coffee? And so yeah, so I'm not really sure about all of that, but I think for the everyday, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think instead of spending lots of money on looking at outer space, we could do some more work on inner space and the relationship of different people's inner spaces. And I think ceremony is like acknowledgement. It's like saying, I see you. It's like saying, I acknowledge you exist. I understand you have a past, present, and future. I understand you have a domain that you occupy and you relate in all these different ways. I acknowledge that. And so a ceremonial way of using the internet might be to acknowledge, and then maybe we would have to learn how much energy is being consumed, say in this call, right? Because we can also take these things in a healthier doses. Yeah. So not only the coffee or anything that is a stimulant, but all foods have their effects. You know, one can eat too much. There's a Caribbean saying, too much of something is good for nothing, right? You know, it's like everything in moderation and everything really deeply acknowledging its place. Right now, with our levels of overconsumption of everything, we've lost a sense of boundary and proper relations with each other, and with each other means with each being that is part of this planet. We've lost sensitivity towards each other. And I think to regain that, if ceremony helps, yes.
So because it's almost past, so I think we're going to have to wrap up very shortly. But there's one more question that I thought might be a helpful note to end on, perhaps. So it's a question about resistance and whether some of the kind of interspecies care practices that you've been exploring in both of your works, really, have you kind of experienced resistance on a personal level to trying to foster interspecies care on the part of different producers and consumers? And if so, what's been your approach in the face of those who are resistant to sort of rethinking their perspective on different species?
Well, I haven't. I mean, I've made this piece called What's Eating Reality, which I interviewed Mama D for, and people came along. It's like a dining experience with like projections onto the table of different perspectives. And I've found that people have come with a different perspectives, but not with a resistance. They've come with maybe a little bit of trepidation, but like an openness to have a dialogue.
Yeah, that's true, and I've participated in this, and it is it's provoking, it's mind provoking, it's conversation provoking, it's heart provoking too, which is, and we should have more experiences of this nature. And I suppose I'd like to close what I'm saying with this little story, which I have shared, and you may be, I know, Maya, you're familiar with, but it's concerning something that happens every day that you leave your house. You leave your house, you go out of the door, out of the gate, and there across the road, you encounter a man, and he's beating a dog. Every day you leave your house, you encounter this man, and he's beating the dog. The dog is clearly in agony, and you are witnessing it day after day. And I ask everybody who's on this call, and for them to repeat this story to others, who is traumatized? And sometimes people point out, well, I'm traumatized because I'm witnessing this really awful thing. And the dog is clearly traumatized. But who is central to the trauma of both observer yourself and the dog? Is it not the man who is the holder of that violence? And isn't there a narrative behind that man which causes him to continuously perpetuate that violence? And we need perhaps to look at the source of all the violences, all the disruptions, yeah? And in understanding the core of it, we have the possibility of finding, just like with good medicine or good healing, one doesn't cure just the symptoms, one goes to the source and tries to understand it, and recognizing there where the problem is also the solution. So we can end our own trauma, we can end the trauma of the dog simply by dealing with the core problem. So what in that context is the idea of resisting? Is it a stubbornness to simply acknowledge what is? And if one approaches what is the reality, that's a good term, right? What the reality is about any situation, one can normally find its inverse or its complement, which is some form of healing, some form of balance making, yeah, so that we can move towards something else. And I think the core traumas I spoke of earlier, in terms of how we relate to other beings on this planet, is very much related to understanding ourselves, not only in space, but in time, and being patient, knowing that we have to work on that core understanding to be able to come to some really critical healing, especially now.
I feel like it needs to end now, but I didn't want to have the last. I just think that's such a, thank you for ending with that story, and thank you both for sharing your work. As I said, my first response was a really emotional one, and I think the discussion as well has been really fantastic. So thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
Great to chat to you, Eva. Really enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Thank you, Maya and Mama D, for that transportive multimedia meditation on those different species which touch all our lives. And thank you, Eva, for unthreading all those different complexities and resonances throughout the discussion. We're extremely grateful. I won't look at my cotton shirt or bananas or coffee in the same way again. I really mean that. Tomorrow night we'll be premiering a poetry reading and discussion with Nat Raha, Barney Capel and Raymond Antrobus. And on Friday, Maggie Nelson will be talking to us about her new work On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint. And we'll be joined in conversation with poet and critic Sean Hewitt. So please join us for those. Promise to be fantastic events. For details, just go to our website, which is criticalpoetics.co.uk/summer. We'd like to thank our partners, Nottingham Contemporary, Curated and Created NTU, and Metronome. Technical support for this event was provided by Metronome, so thank you Jake in particular. The books related to this series are available via Five Leaves Bookshop, Nottingham's leading independent bookseller, and to find out more, just see the details in the event description. And those in the UK are entitled to a 15% discount. And references to any works that Eva brought out in the discussion here will be available on our website. We'll make sure we put that up on the event page. For now, good evening. Thank you to our speakers, and we'll see you at our next event.